I'm Dane Rose, graduate of more than 30 high workshops and the assistance training, as well as working personally one-on-one with 4 of the high facilitators. I'm going to be using a script mostly because the breadth of content and the very personal ways that it's affected me tends to spiral down into nuance for me. And I wanted for this particular video to stay briefer than I have in some of the other videos. My first level 1 was in 1993, and what follows is a rough map outlining what I see as both the gifts I have received and the organizational and facilitator blind spots that have slowed down or reversed my path towards healthy, loving relationships. I want to begin by honoring the team at the Human Awareness Institute. These are people, if you're a participant or thinking of becoming a participant, who, like you and I, have received so much value from the workshops that they not only volunteer and work very long hours during the workshops, but volunteer to spend money to show up at the workshops for what is a more limiting and more demanding experience in many cases than the participants. And the team, since 1993 in the workshops I've attended, have in a number of instances brought me more integration, more support than the facilitators and the other participants, making it such that at times in a more liminal state where I'm not sure if pushing the envelope is the best thing. It kind of depends on how much support is there for me. I'll look online and see who is the team. I'll look to see who the facilitators are, but also who is the team. And if a few key people who I know have my back are going to be there, I'll show up. And so I really want to honor the role that the team has made in doubling the value of my workshops. In addition, approximately half of the roughly 70 lovers that I've been partners with were met as fellow high participants and occasionally team members. The focus on clear communication, requests, boundaries, and respect for boundaries, and sharing beneath the surface has led me closer to my ideal relationships, which are relationships that have a balance of heart, mind, and body, which diverges a little bit from American culture that tends to be about 80% mental. Are honest and support both people's growth. I can also say that not being in any of those relationships at present, what is taught in the workshops is relatively rudimentary and leaves unspoken many additional skills which people, including myself, need to succeed. For those wishing to move beyond the skills that High teaches excellently, including scripting requests, clarifying, etc., yeses and nos, better self-care, I want to share the resources that have been most helpful to me and which might serve as a leg up, with a reminder that in Sonia Lyubomirsky's book and research on happiness and happiness data, that more than 40% of our daily happiness is a direct result of the quality of our daily habits in relationship with ourselves and others. And that 70% of our career path will be determined by our choice and quality in relationships. So relationships are a big deal, and it's a little bit ironic that we live in a culture where there's not a single day of formal relational and emotional education in school, and yet it's the biggest thing that will affect everything, including whether our math skills, etc., amount to anything. Awareness of my highly sensitive biology, as referenced in Dr. Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Person, which was actually just made into a documentary. A 10-minute quiz to find out if you're part of the 10 to 20% of the population, depending on how sensitive is the metric, can transform a life. And if you look at things in business, such as the 80-20 principle, where 80% of your results will be earned from 20% of your activity, gaining key pieces of information, such as are you or are you not in this highly sensitive person category in your biology, which incidentally has been shown to reflect itself in a number of mammalian groups, including rhesus monkeys, is definitely one of those 80-20 activities. 10 minutes of your time can change your life. So I put that test among the resources for you. That book, since I'm in that category, has increased my skill and ability to navigate the world and relationships by roughly 30%. The next thing that has helped me is clarifying the top 3 of the 5 love languages. And this is, again, one of those areas where a very short test can tell you if you're speaking love in the language of your partner, your friend, if they are speaking love in your language, which is ultimately everything, because if someone's talking Japanese and you hear English, it doesn't land. It doesn't have meaning for you personally. So this is another of those examples where a 10-minute test led to reading a book that has benefited my life about 15% and made for some great conversation, getting to know people. As someone with early childhood attachment trauma with both parents, a term and diagnosis I learned for the first time 2 years ago, my own book, The Art of Partnering, explores how to turn endings, among other things, into a conscious, kind, and honoring relationship that both people design. Now, I kind of stumbled into a great ending in my first relationship because there was so much panic that I had as a result of the early childhood attachment thing, venturing into my first romantic relationship that I started scripting everything. You know, it was definitely an area where I chose a much older woman with a lot of skill, but a very strong leadership personality, verging on bullying at times, Enneagram 8. And having the ability, as someone who is conflict averse, to script and basically walk each other through what we would do before we did it and make sure that that was a script that was comfortable. Something that you'll learn in the high workshops because the facilitators are following detailed, nuanced scripts to create fabulous experiences roughly 80% of the time. And so scripting is a very powerful tool to illuminate difference and find convergence before upping the volume to full intensity and living it with all the five senses. And one of the more important scripts, which we actually choreographed with a relationship coach at the time, was how we were going to end our relationship in, as a protocol and in principle first. And we did it very beautifully, separating our business and our relationship, which was quite miraculous. And so I wanted to share that process, which has actually made many of the endings of the partners that I've been lovers with and at times friends with some of the most growth-filled and beautiful experiences of both of our lives. Spending time in other cultures that are more feminine and also very different has helped me enormously. And the relationship that I'm in right now with a Filipina is, I would say, absolutely crucial. Meaning, I do not know how to create this particular quality and set of experiences in relationship that I've never experienced with a British or American woman, two places that I've lived. And so I think there's a really important role in understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each culture and including that in the decision based on where we're at. Like, I'm going through a tremendous amount of emotional volatility and trauma, which I'll get to a little bit later in the video. And that makes sensitivity, gentleness, receptivity, responsiveness, spontaneity, and immediacy with the full spectrum of emotions very, very medicinal. And it's important to understand the uniquenesses of the different cultures. So travel is actually a very important part of what I have learned and used to create relationship success. Another thing that I haven't learned in any other place other than through my own observation is what I call inner ages. And the best way to introduce you to it, perhaps, is to ask you to reflect on how old you feel inside and how that affects your response. For example, in part because of regression back to early childhood traumas that have not fully been resolved, I often feel like I'm 2 years old. Sometimes I feel like I'm 5 to 8. Sometimes it's teenage years. And it's only been relatively recently that emotionally I feel at times much older. And this is important to understand because if you understand that regardless of your physical body age, you have an inner emotional age that is varying moment by moment, and your partner has an inner emotional age, one of the greatest check-ins is how old do you feel right now? Here's how old I am. How old do you feel right now? Now, if you know you've got two 2-year-olds in the room, it gives an insight on what's needed. What do 2-year-olds need? They need holding, they need loving, they need bonding, they need a lot more unconditional acceptance and comforting. So if that's the emotional age, that's appropriate. But what happens when the young ones are loved and cared for and able to relax is you return, you start rising up in a healthy way without dissociating from the magic that is sourced in the youngest parts of our innocence and our young ages. This dialogue and noticing the facial expressions, if you pay attention, certain situations will regress just about anyone. And it is critical, if you want to stay in win-win harmonious relationships, that you track the moving ages of your partner and vice versa. There's no other way than the regular check-in. How old are you right now? The next question is, what does that part of you need? I'm 2-year-old, I feel desperately needed, I just needy, I want to be held. Okay. You can do it, you can't do it, but it gives you a starting point. Meta conversations are another powerful tool along these lines. They're the conversation about the conversation. So a meta conversation might be, right now, as you're listening to this video, what's distracting you, reducing the value for you? For example, the way my phone is built, the camera's off here, I'm watching myself here. When I watch the videos, it always seems like I'm looking off a bit to one side. And yet, when I'm making the videos, it looks like I'm looking myself in the eye. And so that's an example of something that might be distracting you as the viewer. And just voicing that. What's distracting you? What's reducing the value? I have a bit of a sore throat. I'm outside my Thai hotel with ambient noises, and there's different repercussions of all of this. And what's adding value? Like, was it the sensitivity piece? Like, bringing you in, pausing the conversation to say, how are you feeling? What's your body going through? What's your heart going through? Where's your mind right now? This is a way to triple the level of presence and engagement. I use it constantly, particularly if I don't feel my partner's fully present, or if I'm not fully present. Pause. I'm thinking about this. What do you, can we talk about that? Pause. You're looking off in that direction. What's so important about that while I'm talking to you? It's like, well, the cat's moving around. Well, and you clear the space and keep coming back to where the imagination and the presence wants to be. This, again, not something that I've learned as much as something that really works, and so I do it all the time. The books The Body Never Lies by Alice Miller, along with The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, opened my eyes to the awareness of trauma and PTSD as biological phenomena, rather than something that can be addressed purely psychologically. Now, this was big news for me. Number one, I never knew what the word trauma meant. I just knew it's the kind of thing people who have car bombs going off in Iraq or Vietnam feel. Flashbacks, and it's like, of course they would. And yet, it turns out that, for example, when you're 1 year old and you've got the equivalent of 30 feet giants moving around you who have your life completely in their control, they could step on you and you're dead. They could drop you and you're dead. They could leave you and you're dead. And when you're in that vulnerable state, with a scale where you're weighing, 10 pounds, 5 pounds, 20 pounds, and they're weighing 100 pounds, 200, 300 pounds, these are giants. And understanding that at that scale, the relationship of scale and intensity and energy exchange is such that a very small degree of dysregulation, of unattunement, is experienced as a high degree of violation and violence for a child, means that it's incredibly easy to give an infant experiences equivalent to Vietnam for an adult. It's the same kind of shock and dissociation. And this is particularly true when you have parents suffering from trauma, addiction, etc., etc. And so it was a huge blind spot that none of my therapists, including the 4 facilitators, including the high workshops, gave me any clue that I might be dealing with trauma, number one. Number two, what the word meant. And number three, that trauma and traumatic memories are stored in the body, not the mind. And that they need to be worked with somatically. Now, why is this so important? Well, let me take you into the second lover experience I had in my level 2. As an illustration of the ways that trauma has permeated every one of my relationships, including with the roughly 30 high participants to varying degrees. So, we make love on a Sunday night, and it seems on the surface to be a very clean and following high protocol terrain. There's nothing terribly complicated. I ask a woman in her 50s, I'm 28, I said, I've had almost no lover experience in my life. I'm wanting to get a sense of who I am as a lover. Would you be willing to be my partner on Sunday night? After the workshop, we'll rent a room, and would that be a good fit for you? And she said, sure. I mean, this is the kind of permission request. I said, let's have a safe sex conversation. Again, high protocol, etc. Very straightforward. But this is where high let me down and let my partner down. Because one of the aspects of trauma is dissociation. You disconnect from some of the most intense emotional reservoirs in your psyche in order to cope and get through the day at key points in trauma. So here's what actually happened in that moment. First of all, it was the first time I had a deeply energetic experience of sex. And I think it might have been hers as well, because the energy went so deep through the eye gazing, etc., that it was a transcendent state. Now, Hai had not taught me that I was part of the 10% of the population that was highly sensitive. Again, a negligent oversight when it's just a 10-minute test, and 10% of our population is in this category biologically. Now, she may have been as well, but that conversation didn't take place, of course, because we both had taken 2 of the workshops and were feeling like we're mastering this communication thing. It's just not relevant to what's coming up for us. And so I leave my body, I fall deeply in love, and as a highly sensitive biologically, is so overwhelming that I feel almost comatose afterwards, after the intensity. And this is, again, very important to understand for highly sensitive, the intensity of these 3-day workshops, enormously intense. Following the most intense kind of psychological experience of my life. And she falls deeply into attachment. Now, I explained to her that I'm going to need at least 8 hours of sleep, and I'd like her not to touch me until I wake up and start talking, because I know my body without knowing anything about highly sensitive and stuff. I just know my body. So I explained that to her, and she seems to get it. But at 4 a.m., she's decided to go home early, or maybe that was her plan all along, but she starts prodding me. And I've only slept for 4 or 5 hours. And I know I can't move in this state. I know how my body's built, and I've got to go through this deep recharge. And there's some part of me that wakes up, but my body is not woken up. And she's prodding, and it's like, what are you doing? I said I needed sleep, and I'm trying to think, and I'm dissociated. But she then goes into a rage. And she says, you're just like all the other men. You're just interested in my body. You don't care about me. You just want me to leave as if nothing happened, this, that. And she becomes totally vitriolic. And I'm panicking because I can't wake up fully. I've no idea what's happened. I mean, what other men? Who, it's like, I've just had the most emotional experience of my life. Now, this is an example of how a deep trauma and abandonment of hers, and a misunderstanding of sensitivity, and a misunderstanding of trauma, and the lack of conversation about trauma, led her to re-traumatize me, turned one of the most sacred experiences of my life completely sour, and left me completely alone dealing with it. And it left her as she stormed off. And I tried, when I woke up that next day, I tried calling her. And she just swore, and she didn't want to hear anything other than that I hated her and that it was just sex. And she kept hurting me the more I talked. And Hai has never dealt in 30 workshops with how to deal with this. But this is what one may deal with. I mean, I'm giving one little taste of 30 different flavors of trauma and weirdness and confusion. And the danger is in, when Hai says we're committed to creating a world where everyone wins, the danger is that blind spot. It's like you're not committed to even explaining the territory. And when you say, could you keep it short, and there's no place for a deep share, how do you come out of that? How does Hai learn from that? So this is the terrain of trauma. And it's that much more potent for highly sensitives. It's that much more potent for people with early childhood attachment. And this work, along with Brené Brown's work on shame, is key. It is, I would say, the fountain of success and the fountain of failure in most romantic relationships. More than 60% of Americans, for example, have varying degrees of unresolved trauma. And that's just the current statistic. It might be much higher. 60%. Well, that means it's almost certain that one person in the relationship is dealing with something they don't know how to deal with. And they may be covering with addiction, this, that, the other. The point is, that's the terrain that disrupts the relationship. It isn't the giggles, it isn't the pleasure, it isn't the fun, it isn't the altered states, it's not the weekend in Tahoe. That's not what fucks you up. It's this terrain that is systematically blocked from view in all polite society and is not addressed head on. It is a blind spot. And if you want to succeed statistically, systematically, predictably, and not know about this, you're going to fail. It's that simple. Now, the work of John Gottman is unique in a culture that is so devaluing of the feminine and emotions, etc., that it's just about the only science being done on relationships. I mean, for something that will affect your career 70%, your happiness at least 40%, to spend less than 1% of research is not logical. There is a cultural blind spot and a cultural taboo to serious science being done in the area of relationship. And John Gottman, thankfully, for more than 40 years, has been studying the art of predicting a couple's success, etc. Check it out. I've experienced regularly when I listen to his books, a good number of them, all scientifically and statistically based, I've regularly experienced the phenomena of hearing him talk about a conversation, pausing the Audible book, calling my partner or go talking with her, and immediately noticing the quality of our intimacy going up 20-30% in a matter of an hour. This is high quality material. Again, not discussed at Hai. Many effective books on business, including Stephen Covey's brilliant book, The Third Alternative, which teaches protocols to actually win with someone in difficult situations, is great. See, and here's the thing. We're in a largely material and materialistic culture that, has experienced an explosion, a beautiful explosion of scientific discovery and protocol that has been applied almost everywhere except relationships. The crossover point is business. In a materialistic culture, the god is money. And when the god is money and the protocol is science, and you've got to have relationships with people to make money, you kind of come in through the back door. And if you look at the best business literature, for example, the book Principles by Ray Dalio, you will gain the benefit of the millions and billions that is spent learning to make better money, which is dependent on having cleaner, more win-win relationships, because you can't win in the long run. You know, in the great companies that grow and become institutions of, you know, in leadership, these companies have to rely on reasonably good relationships. They can't rip people off, etc. And so you'll actually find, you know, for example, in leadership, board leadership, ethics and stuff, some of the organizations study the Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger in their recent 2017 shareholder. They're much more tuned in than many of the New Age organizations that, you know, filled with fluff. But, you know, because we worship money and because certain things do work, business people are often a little bit more interested in the truth. So I find that to be a wonderful arena to explore. If you understand that high will teach you 30% of what you need to know, and it's up to you to find the rest and educate yourself, you will start out ahead of where I started out. In addition, I think that the above books and work they have led me to do is an additional 40%. So I'd say I learned 30% from high, and that what I've just talked about is another 40%, which brings you up to a 70% mark, which means that 7 out of 10 of my relationships I would consider to be well above average in growth and win-win and consciousness and health, going through a full birth, maturing, and dying process. For good reasons, without, you know, betrayal and stuff like that. Trauma and its various ripple effects have definitely been the biggest kind of exploder of the vast amounts of relationship capital that can be built up with these approaches. So it's a very big, it's kind of the key thing to understand, in my opinion. Now, 4% of the population, being a bit generous, are just going to luck out, just like lottery winners and this and that, and they're going to beat the odds for one reason or another that might, you know, it basically appears to be chance. However, you don't want to go to a casino with a 4% chance of you winning. So if you want to have the kind of winning streak in growth, healing, integration relationships that most of us want, it's going to require a lot more work than just lucking out 4% of the time. And so I think the biggest danger is not understanding that and hoping for a fairy tale ending without doing the work of building the castle. I want to touch on High's mission statement for a moment. The Human Awareness Institute, High, empowers individuals to be potent, loving, contributing human beings. High promotes personal growth and social evolution by replacing ignorance and fear with awareness and love. High aims to create a world where people live together in dignity, respect, understanding, trust, kindness, compassion, reverence, honesty, and love. The Human Awareness Institute is committed to creating a world where everyone wins. And there's definitely debate in the corporate world about whether to have a mission statement, this and that and the other. But one of the things that's good about a mission statement is it can highlight contradiction. And so I want to talk about some of the contradictions in the mission statement in my own experience with High, which hopefully you as a participant and or team member can use to lift some of the veil of insanity that is otherwise kind of a fog in the space when you're in a bit of a crazy-making environment. And the facilitators have a role as a business owner. So there's the role of the service provider and consumer. There's the role of the nonprofit, which is public service, which is a role of sacrifice. The basis of the tax exemption of a nonprofit is that you are working not for your own maximum gain, but to be of a public service. And so there's a sacrifice of optimal profit for the mission, which is one of community service. And so there's the mission staff, and then there's the recipient of that mission. There's the teacher-student polarity, in which, in this case, the role is to teach everything that is required for the student to succeed in their subject. And the student's job is to learn everything that is there to be taught. There's the community leader role, because High is more than just a workshop, it's actually a community, and that's one of the more valuable parts. And so the facilitators and team serve as community leaders. And the job of a community leader is to foster health and the values of the organization within the community. And so there's varying degrees of success in that category. And these are all in the arena of healthy, loving relationships. And blind spots and growth opportunities are inherent in every organization. And here are some that I think are important and that I've experienced in High. A blind spot about the training necessary to do deep one-on-one work and the ethics of presenting facilitator expertise without being licensed to do the work. In other words, in my observation, there is no terrain psychologically that a facilitator has said, no, I'm not qualified. I've worked with 4 of them. There's no terrain that facilitators recuse themselves from. But they are not licensed and fully trained psychotherapists. And so, but this has not been disclosed until very recently as a result of some of the stuff I'll be talking about. This is particularly troubling with the paradox of Peter Sandhill simultaneously inducing one of the biggest traumas of my life on 2 occasions, and telling me during that period that he considers himself to be a trauma expert, better than Peter Levine's trauma experts in some situations. And you can see the attached video about how to notice abuse by a therapist, because it's actually more common than I had hoped and thought. A blind spot about grandiosity. On the one hand, High's mission statement makes we are committed to creating a world where everyone wins, but this grandiosity is paired with not a single protocol that says this is how we create win-win. And this is actually the biggest criticism of corporate mission statements, is fluff that means nothing. You know, the people on the staff, you know, in the corporation don't say we're out there trying to help the world. As we're lying, doing this, that, and the other to try and get through the day, and it's just not congruent. So a mission statement in and of itself doesn't do anything at all. It's the mission statement paired with its protocols. And FedEx, in the book In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters, FedEx with its mission when it absolutely has to get there overnight. Well, FedEx has a special award and a commentary and a culture, such as we rent helicopters to honor a man who actually parachuted into a power station to reconnect the power line for an airport so that one of FedEx planes could take off, and thus resupplying the entire airport with power so that their packages could get there on time. And so FedEx has a whole culture of living this very clear, measurable mission and honors its staff that succeed in that. And so in this case, it's a truly integrous mission statement. Months into one of my biggest disagreements in my whole life with anyone, none of the facilitators has even stated what their win was or asked me what my win. And so this is where books like The Third Alternative and actually institutionalizing protocols come in. A blind spot in understanding the role of trauma in preventing most sustainable relationships. By leaving all mention of trauma out of the entire high curriculum in a culture where 60% of people do have varying degrees of unresolved trauma, high becomes negligent in identifying a real threat to well-being. And I would say that bringing awareness into this area would increase the effectiveness of the high curriculum by roughly 30%. And if high is not willing to deal with that itself, Jason Wesson has indicated that he's not, then they need to refer people, they need to identify the blind spot, protect participants from re-traumatization during workshops, which is not uncommon, and direct people to trained professionals. The other blind spot is around love, impact, and, quote, help. I've watched Peter Sandhill and every facilitator do a number of things in relationship to me that magnified what was initially a relatively small wound into something 1,000 times bigger under the name of love, while absolutely refusing to hear the impact that they were having. And language is a symbol of an experience. The word love in and of itself is just a sound. But it means, this sound, we've given it meaning. And what love is supposed to mean is experiences of well-being, experiences of trust and trustworthiness, experiences of sustainable flow, of pleasure, of growth, of integration, of acceptance, of respect, etc. This is the experience of love. Now, language becomes a destructive tool when the words that have the positive connotation get mixed inappropriately and dishonestly with inducing the opposite, experiences of panic, experiences of loneliness, experience of shame, verging on insanity, experience of incredible collapse, grief, and stress. And then rather than doing the work to transform those experiences into understanding, growth, etc., just calling it love. And I think this is a big blind spot within the facilitator body, because I've watched Peter Sandhill in one sentence, just throw me over the edge, into despair and adrenal collapse, etc. And then in the next sentence say, and I'm just loving you. And it's very dangerous when you have your teachers who don't understand impact and are committed to blinding it, to obscuring it. And so this is something I'll talk a lot more about, and again reference the video. How to Notice Therapeutic Abuse, and this is the small version. And this in turn has more negative impact. In other words, to call your worst nightmare love rather than ask you what you experience and own the abuse is actually a form of insanity and increases fear and betrayal and loneliness. You know, that's actually a very common abuse tactic, an abuse pattern, is the abuser doesn't want to deal with their own shadow, so they instead, they hurt you the way they've always hurt you, but they say it's help, they say it's love, etc. I would say that my relationship with each, well, just kind of as context, my relationship with each of the facilitators is professional in the sense that I've never interacted with them except in environments where I'm paying them. You know, paying Peter Sandhill $175 an hour, paying Peter and Sarah Sandhill $120 an hour, paying Ann Watts and Barbara Musser, paying to be at a workshop, paying, so this is a professional relationship we're talking about. And I think that's actually important because I'm taking a unilateral decision for my own sanity and for the safety of team and participants and education to talk about personal things, affecting the facilitator body. But I'm doing it in an awareness that they have elected to put themselves in roles of teacher, facilitator, therapist, business owner, in paid relationships with participants in the goal of their mission. And they have also elected to betray those roles in varying degrees in my case. And I don't take it personally. Hai is actually very big on don't take it personally. And I don't. I don't think I've been singled out to be messed with. I genuinely think these are serious blind spots within an organization that is unfortunately protecting its blind spots at the expense of participant safety. And that makes it a critical thing with professionals in the role and with the ability to do great good and great harm to be held accountable. I also want to point out that this is not a matter of subjective memory or debate in the most abusive aspects of my own experience. The 10-hour audio recording of my first psychedelic experience, in which Peter Sandhill charged me to first push me towards tripling the dose of mushrooms that I was comfortable with, arguing with me for 5 minutes on the tape, and then encouraged taking MDMA while, higher by far than I've ever been, just a brand new experience, and then escalated a romantic relationship with me while high as a kite on MDMA, while high as a kite on mushrooms, is a violation of his marital agreements. It's a violation of every facilitator agreement not to escalate romantic relationships within certain paradigms. It's a betrayal of the therapeutic ethics and guidelines. And this is on a 10-hour recording, brought to the attention of every high facilitator in a desperate cry for help after Peter further messed with things and went into denial and communication control, etc., for 6 months after this, to a point where I couldn't cope. And when I asked every single high facilitator for help, they refused. They met with everyone except me. They discussed it with the board, except no one on the board talked to me. Jason Weston sent me a document asking me to promise never to talk about it and never to sue high. And then Jason said, this is not a high issue. You negotiated this on your own with Peter Sandhill as an individual, when in fact every facilitator had recommended Peter Sandhill to me and trained him. And this had happened in a much smaller version 15 years prior. And Peter Sandhill made comments that I'm never going to trust you again. In other words, when I'm in collapse, he's venting his emotional stress, that this is impacting his life, rather than, this is not service provider, this is not teaching, this is not good business, this is a complete desecration of the very sacred roles that every facilitator is in. And rather than honoring the fact that this is the single most important aspect of high and the biggest threat to its mission, Jason Weston, who has not been trained adequately for his role, any more than the facilitators, says repeatedly that this is not a high issue. And when an apology that I specifically asked for by all of the facilitators would have reduced my sense of betrayal and insanity by 30%, they refused. And they refused to even read the emails, further throwing salt in the wound. And you have to ask yourself, are these people appropriate for the roles they've elected to play? And are they worthy of the money they are asking to be paid? And do they have the skill and the love to put participant safety first in a situation where they can induce trauma but don't even understand fully what trauma is and have not prepared their participant? This is one of the single biggest ethical issues that I know about, and it is a very big exception for me as a conflict-averse, highly sensitive person who would normally walk away from an unhealthy situation. These are paid professionals, and because of their lack of character and skill in this terrain, I've spent well over $100,000 sorting this out, needing, collapsing adrenal fatigue, making several hundred hours of videos to make sense of it, doing diligent reading, talking with some of the trauma experts around the world, talking with ethicists, etc., to get a sense of what real love looks like, of what real health looks like, about what's actually safe for a trauma survivor in this terrain. And these people are not safe in these roles. They're also great people in other areas and teach some of the things in the workshops extremely well. And while, there's plenty of people that just say, sue the bastard, you got him on tape, etc., and that's easily done. The question is, for my values of healthy relationships, how do you create, how does someone respond in a way that is actually best? Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger talk about, it's much better to have someone who undervalues their abilities and, overperforms than someone who thinks they're a genius and, kills you on the operating table. And so on that level, these people are very dangerous because they overstep what they're capable of dealing with as an organization, as a nonprofit. The board is very uninformed and hasn't been trained. And said as much to me when I approached them. But something has to be done for participant safety. And I will not consider a participant safe unless I can imagine a 17-year-old girl with traumatic sexual experience being treated, that the way they treat me would be safe for that girl, because it isn't personal. And so this is, an educational effort on mine to, I'm not discouraging the workshops, and I've never been hurt by a facilitator in a workshop. But these blind spots, when you encourage more sexual activity without adequately preparing, we need a safe trauma conversation more than we need a safe sex conversation, I think, in many cases. And one of the other videos I've made is just the question of how does someone like you and I respond to a situation like this? How does someone heartbroken, betrayed, in adrenal fatigue, re-experiencing childhood trauma induced by their therapist, abandoned, and losing their community, that's threatening the sense of belonging, how does someone respond? Now, my own answer to this question and my own response to this has been get out of the country. America is not the place for depth and emotional sensitivity. Do 5 hours of deep healing work with the best practitioner I could find in the Philippines, spend time in the water, months at a time, just listening to the waves, trying to manage the overwhelm and the panic induced by something very, very big. It was, again, this child giant experience of all of my facilitators colluding to protect themselves and their own blind spots at my expense, and realizing it wasn't personal, realizing how sad it was that our teachers, that the best that I've been able to find in America is rotten on an ethical level and can't even acknowledge it. It's very, very, very sad. And so it's been the biggest experience of my life, both positively and negatively. It's stimulated the most growth. It's taken several years off of my life in adrenal collapse, and when I already have some chronic fatigue from early childhood trauma. It's impacted everyone in my life in major ways, and I'm committed to doing stuff about it, including forming a nonprofit, which is in the works, Happiness Data, to disseminate this. I've also, in the absence of being able to find good therapy that can work with my rhythms and intensity around this, made over 200 hours of witnessing video to show the way trauma affects people day to day, hour by hour, and how it ripples out as a disease, as an imbalance from one person to another, and that it's critical we work together as a community. And so 100 hours of that deals with HIGH specifically and talks about that on a community level and stuff. And if you are an organizational leader, if you are a therapist, if you are someone suffering with trauma, I made this material for you, as well as to witness and give me a buffer, an avenue and a container to talk into that's safe. To understand this terrain and the big paradox of how to move forward in a healthy way when many of these unhealthy elements are institutionalized culturally. They're institutionalized in the trauma of many families and in addictions. And the entire culture is turning a blind eye as long as productivity levels stay high. You know, it's the hypocrisy and the chauvinism. We don't care about the deep feelings and the truth as long as we're making money and looking good. So, thank you for watching. I hope it has served you as you move on your own path towards growth. And Hai has played both roles for me. You know, I keep the 30% that I learned, and I hope that what I'm sharing takes that and amplifies it in a way that's valuable for you.